Hey guys, I'm just out here tending to these little January tomato plants that I've got going on. It's supposed to be winter, but these tomato plants are just absolutely loving the mild, cool days that we're having here. These are all Cherokee purple tomatoes that I started by seed, I guess around late November, early December. And they've just done really well. I put them in pots so we could bring them into the garage during the freezing cold temperatures because they don't really like anything under 50 degrees. But they've been out here with like high 40s at night and they've been fine. So before the spring planting season starts, I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about tomato plants in case you're wanting to start growing tomatoes for the first time, or maybe you love growing tomatoes and just want a little bit more information on how to successfully grow tomatoes better, or maybe a tip or trick that you didn't know about before. So there are basically two different varieties of tomato plants. There's an indeterminate variety and a determinate variety. These here are indeterminates. Cherokee purple are indeterminates. Basically, the difference between the two is that an indeterminate is more of a vining tomato plant, and they will give out fruit from the beginning of spring until frost in when the season's over and the frost kills it. Or if you bring them in, they might survive. The thing about vining and indeterminates is that they can get up to 20 feet tall. They can get huge if you allow them and you give them the space and the air and the proper trellis. Indeterminates can just fruit all season, and they're great for that. Determinate variety tomatoes are more of a bush variety where they don't get nearly as tall and they set their fruit pretty much all at once. Determinate varieties are really great for canning. So if you want to get all of your fruit at one time so that, you've got a big batch to make tomato sauce or, whatever you want to do when you just want all of your fruit at once. Or maybe you just have a smaller space and you don't have a space for a whole lot of, hey Coco, hi baby. If you don't have a whole lot of space for vining tomato plants, determinates would be a really good patio or small garden tomato variety. Another thing about tomato plants is that if you'll notice along the stem, they're very fuzzy. And what these are is they're actually tiny roots. If you go to your hardware store or your garden center and you find that they already have your pre-made starts, they're 5 inches tall or so. They're going to come in a little soil pod. You dig a hole and you put the pod in the ground, and they're going to start growing, and that's great. But what I do to give my tomato plants a little bit of a better root system is I will plant my start all the way in the ground up until right before the very first shoot, side shoot. And what this will do is, even though it's laying down sideways, all of these little fuzzies will then start to put off roots. And it will create a really, really strong root base. And you might be thinking, okay, well, then I'm gonna have a sideways laying plant. But no, after give it like a few days and just trust the process, that end of that tomato plant is gonna curve up and just grow straight up. But then under the soil, you've got this really sturdy root base plus the root ball that's just gonna go straight down and really create a strong root system for your plant. So keep that in mind whenever you are planting tomato plants that have already been started in pods. So another kind of, I guess, thing about tomatoes is that they put off suckers. And suckers are kind of one of those things among gardeners that, to pick or not to pick the suckers. Some people think that you should pick the suckers off. Some people leave them. I pick off the suckers. And what I mean by suckers is, let me see if I even have any to show you. Because I normally pick them all when I see them. But let's just call this one a sucker. They basically grow right here in the little elbow of the tomato plant. And I don't know if you can tell, but there was a sucker right here, and I just pinched it right off. I just pulled it right off, and it doesn't really hurt the tomato plant at all. Suckers, they can eventually put off flowers and fruit. However, they, I believe, are more of an energy drain and an energy suck for the tomato plant that already has established fruit stalks and stems in the middle, like this, that are growing. So I pinch them off because they're very, very tiny and they take forever and they are just not as productive, and they just really suck and drain out the energy to the plant that could be, especially one that's healthy and has a lot of green leaves and doesn't need extra help getting photosynthesis and nutrients to the fruit. I pluck them off. It's kind of your personal preference if you want to or not. Also, tomato plants, they typically need some sort of support system. So especially with this variety that's going to be vining and they're going to get very tall, I will probably stake this or tie this to my fence line so that the stem does not fall over, because already this little guy was leaning over and I had to get a stick and zip tie him to this stick and kind of make my own little tomato stake here for him to get him to stand back up. So they do need some help. Bush varieties do good with cages. Vining varieties do good with like a fence line or a trellis of some sort, because they will outgrow your cage, and then it's going to be a mess trying to get that cage out of a mature vining plant, because then you're going to have to kind of rip it out or just keep it in there and then find another trellis to trellis it to. And so if you already know you have a vining variety, it's best to plan ahead for those. So this little guy here, we moved our plants into the garage, the ones in pots, during the freeze. And I think one of my cats might have, I don't know, broke its stem off, and it was just a stem. It had no green on it anymore. But it still had the fuzzies and everything, so I stuck it back outside with everything else when the weather warmed up, and it started putting off new growth. And a lot of times, there are a lot of gardeners out there that will do something called deadheading or pinching or pruning, clipping, whatever you want to call it, but they wait until their start has 2 or 3 little sprouts of growth on it, and then they will pinch off the growth and just leave 1 or 2 leaves out. And basically what that does is it forces the plant to really focus on the root system, the stem, and stops it from worrying too much about putting off fruit right away, and creates a really hardy stalk and root system that would help basically propel the plant to put off a good set of fruit or vegetables. So we unintentionally did that. I don't typically deadhead any of my veggie starts or my veggie plants, so we'll see how this one turns out compared to the others. If it'll catch up, I'm sure it will. Yeah, so we'll keep an eye on this little stumpy guy, and I'll let you know how that goes. And then I guess the last, or one of the last things I'll talk about for, well, 2 things. Watering your tomato plants. So tomato plants don't typically like to be watered directly on the leaves. They like it if you can, to water directly at the base. You can prevent like powdery mildew. In the heat of the summer, if you're watering, it can scorch the leaves, kill the leaves off. So tomato plants like to be heavily watered, deeply watered, but not to the point where they're sitting in like a soppy soil for long periods of time. You don't want their roots to become soggy, but they like deep water, and not necessarily all over, like just don't spray it all over the plant like a sprayer. And the last thing I'll touch on is, I don't know if you've seen my previous video about adding calcium to your garden. Some people, when they dig their hole, they'll put a Tums, one of those antacids, into their hole because it's calcium. Tomatoes really need calcium to produce good fruit. If they're calcium deficient, you will probably end up with something called blossom end rot, which is basically where the blossom is on the flower. Then once this is fertilized, you're going to have your fruit that comes off the end in a little ball, and towards where this blossom was when it grows out, if it's deficient in calcium, that blossom end will start to rot, and there's pretty much no saving the fruit. You're going to have to just compost it or toss it, and then to get the plant to come back to life, amending the soil while it's already a mature plant is kind of a hard task. It's not impossible, but then you're going to waste a whole lot of time and energy trying to get that plant to absorb calcium again to save the rest of your fruit. And then of course, if you have a determinate variety that's already set all of its fruit and then you end up with blossom end rot, then you're pretty much done. So starting your soil off right is key. And if you eat eggs and you have your eggshells, you can just pop them in the oven, dry them out for about 10-15 minutes on 350, take them out, grind them up into a fine powder, mix them in your soil, and there you go, you've got your free calcium. You don't have to put a Tums in there, you don't have to buy any added extra soil or amendments for your soil. You've got it straight from your house. So that was one of my tips that I shared previously, if you want to go check that video out, adding calcium. So yeah, I hope that you grow tomatoes. I know it sounds like maybe there's a lot to it, but it really isn't. I mean, just making sure they have the proper nutrients, the right home to grow in, and prop them up. When they're feeling down and they're getting too big, you just got to tie them up, and you'll do great. I know you will. So I hope this helps, and have a great time with your garden. Come on, Luna.